is the third week is usually our middle school, but it'll be moved to the fourth week this month, middle school and high school. Our fifth week will have our BIPOC parent and the week after we always have our elementary, which is in the normal schedule, which is next week. So please come to these groups. You can bring friends, family, spouses. These are groups, our way of connecting with other parents, um, who are going through the same challenges. Parenting is not easy, and connecting with other parents may answer questions and situations you may have. Bright Family Engagement Team again welcomes you here tonight. I will now pass it over to Lakeisha, who will be introducing our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Victor. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Katya Sarar. Dr. Sarar worked in a community mental health in the Pioneer Valley of Massachusetts for over 20 years as a director of children, adolescent, young adult, and adult community services program, and a program for the prevention and treatment of early psychosis. An experienced supervisor and trainer, Dr. Sarar has supervised clinicians, students, and teams of staff, and has practiced in residential, in forensics, and in community, and in outpatient and private practice settings. She has provided consultations to agencies in a number of areas. Currently, Dr. Sarar is a senior director of practicum learning at the Smith College School of Social Work. Dr. Sarar is a certified DBT clinician and a certified juvenile court clinician. She's a primary clinical practice areas include adolescent and young adults with histories of trauma and persistent mental illness. Dr. Sarar holds an MSW from Boston College and a PhD in social work from Smith College School of Social Work. Please welcome Dr. Sarar. Dr. Sarar, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that welcome. I'm really excited to be with you all here, parents. And this is a really tough topic. So I'm going to be talking about how to prevent kids, because I understand that there's a whole array of parents here, some who have very young children, and some of you who may have high school age kids. And then I also am going to be talking just briefly about young adults living in your home that may have dropped out of school or who may be beyond 18, or they can stay in school programs sometimes till 26. So I've kind of put a little bit of everything in there. I'm going to share my screen. I think this PowerPoint is going to be available to people, and there are some resources on here that I have included. Use some of these resources to kind of give you a preview, and then there's links to those resources. And so maybe the Bright team here, if people are interested, can reach out to them and ask for a copy of that. So let me just share my screen. Okay. So I'm going to start with talking about risk and protective factors. Very briefly, I'm not going into theory a lot, but I'm going to talk about families and attachment, how to begin conversations about drugs, alcohol, cigarette use, tobacco use, starting even in preschool. We'll talk about some warning signs, a little bit about peer pressure, and then how to talk with your kids when you suspect that they may be using substances. We'll talk a little bit about where to get help, and then I've got some sort of takeaways to summarize. So there are a lot of risk and protective factors. So if you want to think about, is my child or my children or are the children that I'm caring for at risk, there are some things that predispose us to risk. And so some of addiction is genetic. And so if there's a family history of addiction to gambling, food addictions, substance use, alcohol, that can predispose youth and families, youth in the family to use. Any parental substance abuse, any early aggressive behavior can sometimes not predict, but can correlate tangentially with drug use. Low supervision for obvious reasons. Academic problems can be a risk factor. Any undiagnosed mental health issues, peers, the availability, poverty. I'll say a little bit more. It doesn't mean that if you're living in poverty that your child is automatically at risk, but it can be a factor, and not everybody who's living in poverty ends up being a substance abuser. So I want to be really clear about that. And then some social issues as well. But there are protective factors that work across all age groups. Reliable support and discipline. So we're going to talk a little bit about discipline and consistency. The responsiveness of the adults and caregivers around the child. That responsiveness includes protecting your kids from harm or fear, and then opportunities for kids to actually repair with family when there's conflict. And basic needs being met is really important. So it's really hard to parent when you're struggling from day to day with your own basic needs. And then here, if we look at sort of the different groups of school age youth, these are protective factors that are also helpful. So for middle school, some of the family protective factors can be verbal rather than physical discipline, consistent discipline, and family support from more than just who's in the home, but there may be aunties or cousins or chosen family too, that those adults also contribute. For teens, we really start to move into structure, supervision, rules, limits, predictability for them, having supportive relationships rather than antagonistic relationships, and really clear expectations around behavior and values. And that can be really challenging, and it's hard to be consistent. And for young adults, they're moving more, into more independence. And so you're really trying to balance allowing them to be autonomous, but also continue to have them be included in family business and connection. And then really giving them behavioral and emotional autonomy. So when we get to young adulthood, we'll talk a little more about that. I want to briefly talk about attachment. A lot of sort of clinical theory and psychology is out there in the world now. There are tons of resources online if you're more interested in looking at theoretical models, but a couple of areas that I thought might be important to share are attachment and then family systems theory. And so one of the important things that come from the attachment theoretical model is that those theorists really talk about how relationships connect families, and that the primary relationship that a child has at a young age, even from infancy, will be a model for all the other relationships that someone has throughout their life. And our infants begin to talk with us, communicate, even before they can speak, by crying, clinging, cooing, and rooting, which is that sort of using their mouth on everything. How you respond to children from an early age really impacts how that child attaches with others. So if caregivers are nurturing and responsive, generally what attachment theorists say is that children will develop strong attachment to others. And if the opposite is true, if caregivers are neglectful, unresponsive, or abusive, there can be an insecure attachment. Again, the important thing to remember around protective factors is that if there is one nurturing adult that a child can depend on. That's enough to really mediate some of this. And the other thing about attachment is that our style of attachment can change over the lifetime. So just because someone may have had a difficult childhood and may have a more insecure attachment style doesn't mean that that won't improve over time. It shifts and shapes as people have relationships. Some of you may recognize this family. This is the extended family and family group for modern families. I wanted to add systems theory in here because what that has given us in terms of thinking about families and systems of chosen family and caregiving systems is that really it's focused on how all the parts of the system impact one another. So up in the left-hand corner, those are some cells that are a system of cells working together. A coral reef is a really good example of what a system, how it works. So systems comes from ecological theory. And if you think about a coral reef, all of the coral reef is sort of integrated. And if one part of that reef isn't working, the other parts are all impacted. So each member in a family impacts the other members, and an individual cannot be understood, according to system theory, without looking at the family as a whole. The thing about systems too is that they're always striving for balance and stability. So when there's a individual in a family with a problem, you could look at the child who's using substances as the identified problem, but in reality, there are ways that that child is probably trying to adapt into the family system to bring about stability. And there are ways that the family will be interacting with one another to bring stability to that system. So if you're working with a family therapist who uses this kind of perspective, the whole family really needs to be involved in the recovery of someone's substance abuse. Let's see. So it matters because how you relate to your kids is important. And especially when you're going to be having difficult conversations, it really paves the way for that. When relationships are strained, you can change those relationships over time and change how you're relating to one another. Every family member is going to be impacted differentially. So everyone is going to have a different response to what's happening. And looking at the problems and their impact from each person's perspective is going to be important and more effective than just looking at one individual as a problem. So you as families and caregivers are the most important and influential factors in how kids will handle peer pressure and the sort of sexiness of cigarettes, prescription, and illegal drugs and alcohol. And I'm including tobacco and alcohol here because alcohol is a big problem, but tobacco is really a gateway into trying other things. And we're going to talk about kind of marijuana and legalization as well. So recent studies show that when there are adults who have influence on kids and talk to their kids about those issues, who have family meals together or do things together as a family, or even if they're single. I'm a single parent with a single child, so I do a lot of things with my child, just the two of us. Those children will have a lower rate of use and abuse over time. And early intervention is key. And we say that a lot in this country. Unfortunately, in the US, we're not about prevention so much. We're about fixing it after it's already a problem. So as parents, you can be a major factor in preventing by intervening early. So I'm talking preschool here. So, intervening before high school is critical. And patterns of abuse over time get worse in high school. And the earlier kids start using, the harder it is later in life to quit. And there are actual physical reasons for that. I'm going to share a video with you that talks about that a little bit. So talk with your children about drugs and alcohol and cigarettes early on. The way to do that is using teachable moments, opportunities that come up in the day, keeping that communication open, even when hard stuff is happening. Bring love and compassion to those conversations and really balance punishment and consequences with positive encouragement. Every opportunity that comes up is an opportunity to talk. So I'm going to give you some examples. So this is a very young child. Often kids take a vitamin. I think a lot of kids I know around here will take a fluoride tablet from their dentist, until they're 12. When you're giving those vitamins, you can talk about their healthy body and explain what they're taking it for, and that they only put things in their body that are good for them. And it's important to look at skills that you'll build with young children that are going to help them develop into confident kids with self-esteem who are able to have the skills to make decisions on their own and to problem solve. So even in their play, kind of supporting children in gaining confidence, self-esteem, and skills that can help them solve problems are going to go a long way when you get to harder things. If you're watching a movie or you see someone walking by in your day-to-day life, you can use it as an opportunity to talk about how it's bad for your body and the impact of that. Cigarettes and alcohol, kids are used to hearing about that in schools. Here in Massachusetts, we might be more progressive, but there's some pretty great prevention models that they're building into our elementary and middle schools. And by 6th grade, my son was already really anti-cigarettes, anti-alcohol, and anti-drugs, and has a really strong opinion about that. And that was really from school. Use a calm tone and explain using words that your kid can understand. So speak at that level. Smoking is dangerous to the body and the brain, like just very simple language. Then when you get to the tweens, your 8 to 12-year-olds, they're pretty open and they're not as judgmental with us at that age. So they're more likely to talk with you about what's going on at school and who's smoking and who's doing what they've learned. And so you can really take an interest in who their friends are, talk about who they're hanging out with. You're certainly going to probably be connecting with other parents and guardians, and ask a lot of questions that are open-ended. So not like, did you have a good day at school? But tell me a little bit about your day, something that doesn't just require a yes or no, and try to stay as non-judgmental as you can. Even as somebody in the field and in the business, the language that kids are using for drugs and alcohol is changing really rapidly. And there are different names for that. So people who are working directly with substance abuse may hear that from folks that they're working with. But as parents, we really need to do some research. And there's, again, the Google is your friend, to find out sort of what are the nicknames of these drugs and what's the impact on kids' health and mental health, so that when they have questions about it, you can answer it. It's also fine to say, I don't know the answer. Why don't we go online and see if we can find the answer to that together, which is also a way to connect. There's a lot of examples on the news too, like doping in sports, and the legalization of marijuana is still a big news topic from time to time. So as those stories come up, you can have conversations with your tween about those things. I want to talk about the teenage brain, because when young people get to sort of pre-puberty and puberty, the brain actually is wired to be more risk-taking. And so that's why a lot of dangerous stuff can happen when kids take risks, because they're driven to take risks. And this is a really increased time of brain development. And it's important to remember that young people's brains aren't fully developed until the age of 26. So they don't really understand that A plus B equals C. They have a very kind of invincibility feeling of I can do anything. And also, and so that combined with, not really understanding cause and effect can be really dangerous if you think about the fact that they're driving at 16 and they're out there more independent, making choices. And their friends become way more important. If you have a teenager, you know that they're in their room, on the phone, on Snapchat and Instagram. What their friends have to say is way smarter than what we have to say. And so they're more open at this time to peer pressure. So they will be coming home. My son's now in 9th grade, and I hear about the kids who are vaping in the bathroom and who uses drugs, and that there are parties where kids drink at and drive. And so for teens, they often want our opinion, but they'll sort of be really casual about how they say things and then look for kind of how you react to that. So they may say something about, Susie, my friend Susie, is her mom vapes and Susie was using a vape thing, and then change the subject to like, what are we having for dinner? And so that's really an opportunity for you to say, I'm really interested in that. Tell me more about that. What do you think about that? And engage with them at the level of thoughts and feelings and ask about friends. Because you're going to want to know kind of what's going on in their lives. And it's very important to discuss the dangers and the impact of drugs and alcohol and driving. And it's important too to work with your teen on how to problem solve ways that they can say no and also maintain friendships. So something I've talked about with my son, for example, he's a really gifted runner. And so if he's at a party and someone that he respects or trusts is offering him alcohol or marijuana or some other kind of drug, he's been practicing how to say, it's really important for me to stay in shape because I'm training, and he runs track 3 seasons out of the year. So that's a built-in way to say no. My nephew, on the other hand, he is a football player, but he also always volunteered to be the designated driver so that his friends would get home safely, and he had an excuse not to engage in drug and alcohol use. So practice how they can say no with them and set scripts with them and make really clear limits about car use and how late they can stay out. And if they need to be picked up, always agree to pick them up with no questions asked, so that they're more open about asking for that. Young adults and adults are a lot harder. And I don't want to, we don't have a ton of time, so I want to make sure that I get through the whole thing. But it can be really complex and difficult to resolve. And so when we're talking about young adults, whether they live at home or they don't live at home, it's just as difficult. You would use the same skills with teens, listen, be calm, come from a place of support and care about their well-being, ask them what their suggestions are around substance use and abuse. And this is really important. I've worked with a lot of parents who've come in and said, I want my kid to live at home and be at home because I worry what will happen. I think they're going to die if they're out there, they're using, and I'm at least I can keep an eye on them. On the other hand, they've been violent, they threaten us, they break stuff, they steal from me. So it's really important to know that physical violence, threats, breaking things, and harassment is considered domestic violence, and it is okay to call the police. It's really difficult. It doesn't mean you don't love your child, but safety is important, and setting a limit around something that can escalate, especially when they're bigger and stronger than you, it's important. Problem solve one thing at a time. Don't say like, you need a job, you need to be in school, you need to stop using, pick the biggest thing you can and work on that. Don't try to do the whole thing. And take care of other family members. Often there are siblings and other family members that get sort of put in the corner because the kid with the problem becomes the biggest focus. And so really pay attention to the other kids in the household and see what kind of support or help they may need. Have boundaries and consequences and be consistent. If you're sometimes setting limits and other times you're not, you're going to actually reinforce behaviors more. It's like a slot machine because the kid never really knows what the boundary will be. And then you can work on teaching life skills. In terms of peer pressure, I already talked about this a little, so I'm not going to say a lot, but start young, building confidence and self-esteem and decision-making skills, and then work on helping kids come up with ideas with using a script or having alternative activities to offer friends. And also talk about the psychological consequences of what it might feel like if they said yes to something that made them uncomfortable. Shame, embarrassment, confusion, sadness. The things that you want to watch for with your kids are warning signs, are temper flare-ups, irritability, defensiveness. Academically, you want to look at poor school attendance, low grades, a lot of disciplinary action, any shift in friendships or dodginess around introducing you to friends or talking about them. And nothing matters attitude. So really low interest in things that used to be interesting or engaging for them, low energy, and of course, finding substances or paraphernalia in their bedrooms. You also cognitively want to pay attention to memory issues, poor coordination, things like slurred speech, changing patterns of sleep or appetite. And looking at this, you can say, well, that's every teenager. So what you're really looking for is a change, something dramatic that is a change. Maybe they're defensive, but now they're always defensive. It's not just here and there. So it's really when you see an increase in some of these things or a decrease in interest. The things that kids tend to use most are, I'm talking about tobacco vaping. That's happening, as young as 6th grade, for me, at least in this school district that I'm in. A lot of smoking cannabis and vaping cannabis. And the thing about cannabis is that when you vape it, it's got a much higher purity, and so the effects can be more adverse. Alcohol, of course, and then prescription drugs are everywhere. They're often available at home. ADHD drugs are really popular, and pain medications. There are students that may use intravenous drugs, but there's a much lower percentage of that than the others that I just mentioned. I'm going to play this brief video because she is like my superhero for kids and drugs. Nora Valco talks about the impact of drugs on the teenage brain and how detrimental that is. So I'm just going to play this.
Based on the survey, it's estimated that close to 11% of the partners are vaping 9 THC. And those, when we're trying to understand the consequences of marijuana laws or marijuana smoking, we can just focusing that vaping is the system. Of teenager years, I'm not going to be paying attention. No, establish that dialogue and seek help if you think that actually there may be something going on.
So it sounds like the sound may have been a little off there. I did put this clip in the resources if people want to see it, but basically she talks a lot about the impact on the teenage brain and how drug use can impact their brain development, and to keep the communication open. So, this is kind of, we started to talk about this already, but don't talk with your child if they're intoxicated. That isn't the time to intervene. Put your own anger and panic aside, take a deep breath so that you can create a safe place to have a conversation, ground yourself even when you're upset. So be calm, grounded, and get on their level literally. So if they're sitting down, you should sit. If they're standing up, go ahead and stand, kind of mirror their body language, and put phones away. Try to keep other family members from interrupting. And then before you get into the conversation, think about your goal. Is the goal just to make sure they're safe and, get through the night, or is there a bigger goal? It's important to express your care and worry, look for nonverbal language, be direct and reflect back to them, and praise and encouragement throughout. It's hard for them to, there may be feelings that they're not expressing, like shame and embarrassment. Think about your posture, be open, don't close yourself off by crossing your arms and legs. Listen more than you talk. And you're probably going to get a lot of criticism. Don't take it personally. Don't get defensive. And if it's difficult for you, then stop and say, you know what, let's talk about this tomorrow, or let's talk a little bit later on when things are a little settled. Know when you've reached your limit, because then you begin to struggle. And it's not effective. And there's a lot of help out there. Talk to the school counselors and teachers that are working with your kids. Find a therapist for your child, for you, and for your family. Talk to your pediatrician. If you're at the pediatrician's office, they have tons of materials on drug use and abuse. You can also just call and speak with a nurse about how to start a process of supporting your kid and There are a lot of support groups to connect with other parents and guardians. One of the biggest impacts that kids with major behavioral and emotional issues and substance abuse is that they lose all of their friends and connections. And that's when you really find out who's there for you. So try to maintain those connections, and find parents that are, just like in the introduction, this is a place where you can get support, but connect with other parents. Don't isolate yourself. And then talk about treatment options and stay engaged with your kid throughout. So in summary, the things I sort of hope that you can walk away with is that relationships matter, and you are critical in keeping your kid focused, centered, and open with you. Start early, use natural opportunities to teach, get familiar with these risk factors and warning signs, educate yourself about what happens to the brain when kids use drugs. It's pretty scary when you see the information. And again, Nora Volkow is wonderful. I think I put 3 clips for you there, but you can also search her. Stay engaged and connected. Even when you're not talking with your child, you can be connected. Be interested. I'm not into Formula One cars, but I started watching this show with my son, and now I'm kind of interested in it. So, find things, look at what they're interested in, and you might learn something. Take care of yourself first. It's like put your own gas mask on before you have difficult conversations, and then attend to them. Again, practice ways to say no to peers and ways to get peers to move in another direction. Get help when you need it, and stay connected with your partner and your family and friends. Couples often move apart from each other while they're raising kids. And so it's hard enough to stay connected when you have kids that are not experiencing problems. But when you're with kids that are having issues, it's more important than ever to sort of work on your partnership. And so that's it. The resources that I have here are about talking to kids, more about risk factors and protective factors, peer pressure, things that adolescents are using. And then the Nora Volkow, there's some longer, she does TED Talks and stuff, but there's some longer videos where she gets into the neurobiology of it. And then in Massachusetts here where I am, there's a project called Project Here that is encouraging, is being used in all public middle schools and high schools, for our elementary and middle schools for prevention and education. So you might want to take a look at that, and there may be similar things in your school. Ask about what's going on in the schools for prevention. That's a good question. So that's it. I went a little over. Sorry about that.
That was fabulous.
Fantastic. Thank you.
That was great.
You're
I learned a
welcome.
lot.
Sure did. Sure did.
Mhm.
It was a lot of information in a short time. So there's hopefully it's a starting off place, and it is fun to poke around and see what's out there. You can stick to websites that are, NIDA, SAMHSA, kind of national institutes that
Right.
collect and do. There's a lot of stuff out there that might not be best, but yeah.
I love that because it felt like such a nice balance of very concrete specific information, but also so much of this I felt like could be extensions on parenting, like great parenting advice in general, right?
Right.
Yeah,
That was great.
Yeah.
absolutely.
I mean, we talk about a lot of hard things with our kids,
Absolutely.
right? Sex, driving is a hard, really scary time, I think, for guardians and parents. There's a lot of hard bullying, there's hate crimes, the current state of the world. Drugs is another one of those things. It gets scarier when they're older. So you really want to start it early and not have to be dealing with a 25-year-old that isn't working and living at your home and that you're struggling with.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I have a 6-year-old and I thought, okay, let me just hold off, but I guess you should need to start
Yeah.
earlier.
I know preschool, that was so helpful.
I know.
Yeah. And again, that's about building their skills. You really
Yeah.
want them to be confident, have self-esteem, and speak up for themselves and learn how to color outside the lines. And, I think you're not talking to them about vaping at age 4. You're really just building their confidence and maybe talking about smoking. They often will point it out. Kids will often say, "Why is that man smoking?" And there may be opportunities like that.
And my
Yeah.
6-year-old is also, he's on the autism spectrum as well. So he has that disability on top of that, which is very scary for me because I don't want someone to kind of manipulate him into doing things that are naughty. So that's another thing I have to teach on top of that.
Yeah.
So
I think that's when it's really important to kind of know what's going on. I had a really hard time when my kid went from 6th grade to 7th grade. Suddenly, I had no idea. The teachers don't reach out anymore. You don't hear about what they're doing. And then 9th grade's even worse. So,
God.
be that parent that is like, what's going on at the school? What are you doing for prevention? Check in with the kids' teachers. How are they doing in class? Like, what is
Yeah.
those teachers know everything, as you all probably know. They know
Yeah.
who's dating who and who's gossiping about what. They can probably share how your kid is doing
Yeah.
socially and emotionally.
Thank you.
Are there questions that people have
I
that maybe they
actually
want to
have
talk?
one from the top of my head.
Yeah.
So, as you know, I work in a hospital over here in Georgia, and actually, I'm actually from Massachusetts, so I did protective with DCF for years. So, a
Mhm.
lot of the things that I've seen were with, especially with teenagers, and you talked
Mhm.
about boundaries with parents and the teenagers, and I see a lot of parents smoking weed with their
Mhm.
kiddos.
Yeah.
What? So I don't know how to work with parents instead of filing DFACs on them or DCF on them in terms of neglect. But where do we have that conversation with parents that are that it's wrong? You just can't sit there and have and smoke weed with your kid. That's just not appropriate. That's not your friend. That's your child. Um, where do we go with that in terms of having that conversation with with families in terms of
Yeah.
that?
It's so now that marijuana is legal in a lot of places, one of the things that Dr. Valco talks about that really stood out to me is that because we had this conversation a lot working with young adults in treatment, because they're like out there, how do we, now that it's legal, how do we say, well, you can't do it? Well, first of all, it's illegal if you're under 21. So, I mean, even you can't even go in the store unless you're 21 or 22, right? So it's similarly to alcohol. We wouldn't be sharing a beer with our kid. Some parents might, but I often wonder if those parents understand, one of the things that's happening is that people's sensibility about marijuana, now that it's legal, there's this sense of, oh, it must be safe. It's okay to use it because it's legal now, and people talk about it as medicinal. And that's fine if you're an adult and you choose to do that, but it's not with kids, especially because of development. There is going to be an impact on their brain development and their cognition. I think there was a statistic that she talked about. They do these like neurological studies that kids lose like 8 percentage points of cognitive development from using drugs and alcohol, and drugs particularly. And she talks about marijuana specifically in high school. So while that brain is developing, it's kind of stunting some of that cognitive growth. And so if those parents maybe have some education, and maybe you can correlate it, like, would you share a bottle of wine with your kid? And maybe the answer is yes. There are also some bad effects with alcohol. And you could talk about the long-term effects. The earlier kids start, the more likely they are to get hooked and to not be able to quit later. So I think a lot of it is about education, um, and some parents just really can't set boundaries. And so maybe there are lower level things that they can start to set boundaries on. And some parents treat their kids as friends, which is also develop, like even just for kids developmentally, I don't think it's comfortable to have a parent that's a friend. It can be challenging to then set limits later. You can't walk it back. You can only make it more. So
Exactly.
it's best to start with the low level thing and then make it more boundaries than set them too high and then walk it back. And same with not setting any boundaries.
Is marijuana addictive? Because I hear it's not addictive.
Well, so absolutely, people become dependent on it. And especially if you have kids that are using, NIDA will say, yes, it is addictive, that it is a misconception that it's not. It hits our pleasure system just like any other substance that we use, and releases that dopamine, reducing, for folks that can reduce anxiety, for some folks it can make them more social, just like alcohol. And so if you have a kid that is feeling better when they use marijuana, then it's really important to say, we need to check out, like if you're feeling anxious when you're not doing this, there are other things that you can take that can be prescribed, and we can talk to your pediatrician and somebody in the mental health field to see, are there other ways we can manage your anxiety? Kids are all anxious and depressed now, and there's a lot of people are also behind developmentally, like socially.
Right.
And so we're seeing a lot of still the ripple effects of
COVID.
our.
Thank you.
We had another question we talked about, Katja, and that was so great. And it sort of bounces back on one of Lakeisha's first questions around the parent. Can you give an example or some things that a parent could say if a young person, a child or an adolescent finds it in the house and it is, say, marijuana that belongs to the parent?
So, I mean, the first thing, if it happened, I actually have a friend that's actively struggling with this. Her kid doesn't know, but she feels extremely guilty, and she's also really dependent on it for herself to get through the day. And I think she's managing some other things with it. It's not okay for the kid to use it. Kids are still developing. I would use that biological thing, just like if the kid is asking you again about alcohol, it's okay for adults. Their brains are the way they are. It still may have effects, but not the way it does when you're a kid. It will stunt their cognitive development. There are studies now that are linking, in the early psychosis program that I managed, there was some linkages for marijuana use actually catalyzing psychosis. So a lot of kids with psychosis in particular can be very reactive to marijuana for some particular reason, and that often can kick off during that developmental stage a psychotic break or be related. So I think really talking with them about, and then also asking them what it felt like for them to find that out, and do they have questions? And it wasn't my intention for you to find this out, and part of that is because it's not okay for you, and there's still a lot of even though it's legal, I think people still feel a lot of this leftover like stigma. I'm using marijuana. That is true for my friend. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but I would check in with the kid first and see, like, how are you feeling right now that you found this? And then the second part is really getting into the education about why it's different for an adult in terms of decision making and what can happen for kids, especially when they don't know how to put on the brakes. They can also get expelled. There are a lot of bad consequences for kids that we can avoid as adults.
Do have some other questions, right?
Okay, so and this might be in general, but me coming from, a West Indian background, and sometimes this is cultural and sometimes it's not, but I've seen it a lot of times in the cultural background where when when parents find out that their kids are using, let's say, marijuana, let's stick with marijuana because that's usually the drug of choice, and they disclose it to other family members, and other family members always have to put in their 2 cents, and well, if this is what I would do, that's tough love, I would boot my kid out of the house, that's what I would want to do. And that's typically what they would do, is a tough love, in terms of to teach them, like, this is not the way to do things, this is how you're supposed to do things, you either clean up your act or get the heck out of my house. How can we kind of teach or reteach families that this, shaming or, tough love is usually not the right decision to do that? I know you did touch on that's not, we have to take a step back and but sometimes when people are set in their ways and their cultures, that is not going to work well.
Yeah. I mean, I would say the older the kid is, maybe the more kind of consequences you could have like that. I think when your kids are younger, there's so many, in some ways, as a teen, they need us even more than when they were toddlers, right? So, I would be curious about, the answer might be that's just how my grandma and my grandma's grandma and my grandma's grandma's grandma did it. But how do you think that would impact? What are you hoping will change? Are there other ways that you can think about that might be alternatives? Can I make a suggestion? Can we suspend and think about some other ways that may work? But I think culture is really strong, and tough love is one way to do it. I think also weighing out what are the other risks that can happen. So is the kid going to end up homeless and get killed? Are they going to overdose because they're now, the other thing is that marijuana is usually the first drug they try, and then they move into things, they move up in the hierarchy of substances. Especially, there are a lot of pills available too, with maybe pain pills less often, but they are using mushrooms, and they're using what is that one? Molly, the drug that makes you feel happy, and the ones they use in the clubs. I think that's still pretty prevalent. But usually they start with tobacco vaping, beer, smoking marijuana, vaping marijuana now more often, which also gets things into the brain. So I might talk about child development and what we know from science, and kids being vulnerable out there, and some of the things that may be happening. Even today, there's so much, people are killing homeless people are freezing to death. Many kids end up homeless or staying with people that are going to make the problem much, much worse. So I might start there. There's no easy answer, and we're all individual, and we come from a lot of different sort of cultural backgrounds and belief systems and values. And I think the best we can do is try to expose people to that, and work with them to think in other ways. Think about things from other perspectives without forcing. You can catch flies with honey better than you can with vinegar.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Really have enjoyed the scripts that you talked about, and having scripts for your child and connecting with young people. And really, the closer you are to your child, the most likely this will not be a problem. But I was wondering, if you have a child that you're older child and you have a younger child, and the older child starts experimenting. How do you talk to the younger child about that? And that might be a challenge because here you are, you sort of had these conversations and you're telling a younger child this stuff is bad and whatever. And then all of a sudden the older child is doing that. Like, now what do you do? Like, that seems really hard.
Yeah. I think it's important to talk about the impact that that may be having on the child and being really genuine about, the thing with teens and children, and this is what I loved about working with them, is they are totally authentic. They tell it like it is. They're direct. I think the more direct you can be, it's hard for you. It's hard for me too, to watch your brother. We're working with him to try to make things better. Talk to me about how you're feeling. Are you feeling safe? Are there things that we can do to help you and support you? Again, I think siblings often get forgotten because, and then they may try to make up for the problem by being the perfect child, and sort of creating a false, like a front that isn't really who they are. That's kind of hiding that scared underneath. And so I think the more time you can invest in also supporting that kid and really separate that out from what's happening with the older child and talking honestly about it, and also speaking with the older child about the impact on the sibling. And they may act like they don't care, but that's where I think family support could be really helpful. So a family therapist can kind of help mediate some of those issues, and you can see a therapist once or twice, or you can engage with in a therapy process for a longer amount of time. You may also just want to get a therapist for that younger child, for a place that's just their place to talk about the impact. And usually folks that are working with younger children will bring the parent in. If they don't, I would ask to be included once a month in that kid's therapy session to just talk about how things are going and how you can help support that child. But I think it's really dividing your time and being really clear that you also love that young child. If you see them moving in that direction, I think then you really need to think about we need to figure out some limits for this older kid. Do we need to get them into treatment? Is there something more sort of harsher that we need to do, other than kind of letting them come and go when they want and use out in the front yard and come home under the influence? I think you need to set some hard limits there.
Thank you so much. You had a wealth of information. I wish, again, I say this every time, but I wish I would have had this information before my kids went through my house and have since moved on to other things. I really like how you made a comment about how relationships matter. And I think that's really what this all boils down to, is how we communicate. And I think as adults, at least I know I was brought up, my parents were in charge. And if I didn't do it, they said it was kind of you can hit the road. And I really, really love this idea of being with with your child and being at the same level as them and being empathetic and caring. It just seems so much kinder. And I know a lot of people might think, well, that kids will get away with whatever they want to do then. But I think having a relationship really matters. That's the core of all of this. So thank you for all this information. We so appreciate it. I just want to let our families remind our families that next week we will be talking about this topic during our parents supporting parents meeting, and we have one on the 9th, Tuesday the 9th, and that's at 7 p.m. both time zones, East and West Coast. Then we'll be skipping a week, and then we'll come back to the 23rd, and that will be our middle school and high school level, our aged parents. And again, still talking about that subject. And then finally, our BIPOC groups will meet the 30th of April. And then we have one more month of learning together. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Katja.
Thank you.
Have a good
Bye.
night, everybody.